This is East Asia Tonight.
Good Friday evening. I'm Oteli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. APEC issues a joint statement on the fundamental challenges facing up talks in South Korea, overshadowed by divisions over U.S. tariffs. The Group Secretariat's executive director joins us for more insights. Now, Japan's economy shrank for the first time in a year and at a faster pace than expected, underscoring the fragile nature of its recovery and threats from looming U.S. tariffs. Now, South Korea's presidential campaign enters day 5. Latest poll showing Democratic Party candidate Lee Jae-myung maintaining a solid lead against his rival, People Power Party rival Kim Moon-soo. And China is hoping for a fair, lasting deal in Russia-Ukraine talks as Turkey hosts the first direct peace talks between the warring parties in 3 years. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, investors had been closely watching the first quarterly results of China's tech giants, looking for cues of revival of long-struggling tech sector. Well, CNA's Roland Lim has the lowdown on whether the market got ahead of itself when it comes to expectations for Alibaba and Tencent and their AI-led rallies. APEC trade ministers have voiced concerns over fundamental challenges to global trade as they wrap up 2 days of talks with a joint statement in Jeju, South Korea, amid increasing fallout from U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs. Well, officials are saying they remain committed to overcoming economic issues in the region and urge greater cooperation.
이런 어려운 상황을 극복하는데 새로운 모멘텀을 이번 통상장관 회의를 통해서 형성했다라는 점에 의의를 두어야 된다라고 생각을 하고.
South Korea's trade minister says the joint statement was hard-won. The bloc during the meeting stressed the importance of global trading mechanisms such as the World Trade Organization and also highlighted the role APEC plays in creating a more resilient and prosperous Asia-Pacific region. Meantime, protesters outside the venue felt that the South Korean government and companies could have done more to resist the pressure from Washington. For the very latest, let's cross now to Lim Yoon-suk in Jeju Island, where the APEC trade gathering was held. First up, Yoon-suk, just how significant is this joint statement breakthrough by these 21 member economies?
Well, it is significant. You know, even a few hours before the meeting ended, there were some delegates and concerns that they were not able to reach any kind of a joint statement because they were not able to agree on some of the wordings in that statement. And so it is significant. And the Trade Minister, Jung-geun, was saying at a press conference after the 2-day meeting today that, you know, that all the 21 economies were able to agree on this and have that joint statement. Now, he said that, you know, they were engaged in intense discussions and there was thoughtful deliberations. But then at the end of the day, he was deeply proud that they were able to reach this historic agreement. And he was calling it the miracle of Jeju. Now, in that statement, apparently the members agreed that there was going to be a fundamental challenges facing the global trading system here. But after they also agreed that they remain committed to APEC being the main forum for the regional economic cooperation. And regarding WTO, apparently they were talking about the World Trade Organization, and they all agreed that they would be supporting the WTO, and there was support for the WTO, but they all agreed that there must be reforms being carried out. Now, the delegates there, you know, that I spoke to earlier did say that the atmosphere there was quite good, and, you know, they did discuss a lot inside the meeting rooms, which were close to the media here. And so we didn't know exactly what was going inside. But it seemed like the delegates, every time they were going in and out of this international convention center here in Jeju, and I was talking to them, they did say that they were very happy that there was this multilateral trade ministers meeting going on because it allowed them to exchange ideas, opinions, and hold meetings, which they all thought was very good.
So it's great that they got this joint statement, but one area that seems to lack this same official response is over U.S. tariffs. What's the stumbling block there?
Well, yes. I mean, Jung-geun, the trade minister here, also told reporters that, there was no official discussion on that matter. There's some of the economists here alluded to this issue in certain contexts. But he also said that, it is very difficult to pursue a joint response as the issues facing the various economies there were very different. And so let's listen to what he said at the press conference on this issue.
공동 대응을 하기가 어려운 것이 이 국가별로 그 처한 상황이 사뭇 다릅니다. 그런 측면에서 뭐 일부에서 그런 얘기가 있더라도 저희들로서는 뭐 결코 동의할 수 없는 상황이었고 뭐 그런 얘기하면은 뭐 그냥 들어만 주는 거지 뭐.
So, as we heard there, it seems like there was some discussion about this, but they were not able to form, a sort of a united front against the United States on this issue. Now, the representative of the U.S. side, Jamieson Greer, was here for this two-day meetings, and he was there at the meetings. But also, he had a very busy schedule here in Jeju, where he was holding bilateral meetings with several countries, including South Korea. Now, the bilateral meeting ended not too long ago here between the United States and South Korea. And after that meeting, we had the South Korea's Minister for Trade, Industry and Energy, Jung-geun, telling reporters that the two sides agreed to hold the second round of formal talks next week in Washington. Now, the talks then will be focusing on 6 areas, such as the balanced trade, economic security, and also the non-tariff issues.
Hey, thanks very much, Lim Yun-suk there with 2 days of reporting live from Jeju Island in South Korea. And for more insights into the APEC meeting, we will be speaking to Eduardo Pedrosa. He's the executive director of the APEC Secretariat a little later this hour on East Asia Tonight. China says it hopes Russia and Ukraine can reach a, quote, fair, lasting deal as the two sides meet for direct peace talks in Istanbul for the first time after more than 3 years of war. In Istanbul, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio wrapped up talks with his Turkish and Ukrainian counterparts earlier today. The three-way meeting was chaired by Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan. Mr. Rubio had said he does not have, quote, high expectations for the Russia-Ukraine talks, calling the current state of affairs a logjam that only Donald Trump can break. The U.S. president says he would like to meet Mr. Putin as soon as they can set it up. Well, Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday slammed the Russian president's absence in Turkey and accused Moscow of not making efforts to end the war. He said his team has a mandate to discuss an unconditional ceasefire, a proposal Mr. Putin has repeatedly rejected. And for more, Ross Cullen joins us live now from Istanbul. Ross, so what came out of those trilateral meetings, and how can we read Mr. Rubio's no-show at direct talks with the warring parties?
Well, that's a bit of management as far as I think we can understand in terms of the fact that the Russians didn't send the president, didn't send the foreign minister, and they chose to dispatch a lower-level team of negotiators here to Turkey. And in response, Ukraine said, well, we did have the president here ready for face-to-face talks. Volodymyr Zelensky was physically present in Turkey, but he didn't come to Istanbul. And the delegation is being led by his defense minister, because the U.S. delegation is not directly being led by Marco Rubio. It is being led by Michael Anton, who is the head of policy planning for the United States government. So it's about trying to manage, making sure that you are not unbalanced when it comes to the levels of the different representations that are having the talks. We've had those first round of talks, and I understand the Russian delegation has now arrived ready for their participation in the afternoon session, which is Russia, Turkey and Ukraine. That symbolic moment that we have been waiting for since even Thursday morning now. Finally, we might get that chance to see the Russians and the Ukrainians in the same room at the same time for the first time since spring 2022 when they met here in Turkey. We've also had in the last hour a word from Andriy Yermak, who is the Chief of Staff to Volodymyr Zelensky. He has been holding meetings with the national security advisors of Britain, France and Germany and the US Special Envoy to Russia and Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. And Andriy Yermak has been saying that we coordinated our positions ahead of the upcoming meeting between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations. Ukraine is ready for peace and for a lasting, unconditional ceasefire. We are also prepared for meetings and negotiations at the highest level. That's a reference to his boss being here in Turkey yesterday, ready for a face-to-face with President Putin, but the Russian leader choosing not to come here to Turkey. We also know that Donald Trump has said, I think it's time for us to just do it in terms of a meeting at that level. So there certainly seems to be encouragement on that side. We've heard from Dmitry Peskov recently, the Russian top press spokesman for the Kremlin, saying that there is that contact. It is necessary to have a Russian leader and the US leader speaking. So we are understanding there will be a meeting at that presidential level at a certain time in the future. But there was an unsuccessful attempt by Volodymyr Zelensky to have a similar meeting with President Putin. And now we are seeing the delegations meeting, and they are certainly at a lower level than presidential.
Ross, what about Kyiv's allies, though? I mean, what are they doing to, exert some kind of pressure on Moscow to enter ceasefire negotiations?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, there's a meeting of the European political community today. Now, that's a gathering of pretty much every country in Europe, including countries like Turkey and the UK that are not in the EU. They're meeting in Albania, so it's another chance for face-to-face talks between Volodymyr Zelensky, Emmanuel Macron, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Keir Starmer, and the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz as well. And they're going to be discussing this idea of imposing massive sanctions on Moscow if it does not sign up to an unconditional ceasefire, which is an ambition that pretty much everybody shares, from the United States to China, Europe, Turkey, and of course Ukraine. They are also discussing the possibility of a trade embargo on Russian exports, and as according to the French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, he said it might come a time to suffocate the Russian economy with devastating sanctions. So that's what's being discussed by Kyiv's allies, ways to force and pressure Vladimir Putin to agree to a halt in the fighting. Ateli?
Hey, many thanks for that. Ross Cullen reporting to us live from Istanbul. Alexander Korolev from the University of New South Wales tells us why President Putin's absence from the peace talks might be justified.
I don't think it was supposed to be a highest level meeting. Putin never mentioned that he would go there in person. He suggested to start negotiations, but he never committed himself to be present at those negotiations. Zelensky tried to sort of flip it over by saying that, look, I'm here, but you are not here, so you don't want to negotiate. But this is not how such serious negotiations work. Top decision makers, like presidents or prime ministers, usually step in when there is a lot of groundwork has been done, and they usually step into the process ready to sign the document, or when the agreement is already there. I don't think that we are at this stage. So I think the relatively low level of delegation from the Russian side is strategically justifiable because, again, the president doesn't participate in the negotiations when there is cannot be a positive outcome. So and it applies not only to Putin. Generally speaking, like top leaders only start direct conversation when there is something to talk about.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, US chipmaker NVIDIA plans to build an R&D center in Shanghai as tighter export restrictions threaten sales in the key Chinese market. And South Korea's government, for the first time, acknowledges the exports are slowing, reflecting concerns over a worsening global trade environment fueled by US tariffs. Hello again. Time now for your business news with Roland Lim. So, Roland, Japan facing headwinds from the U.S. president's trade war?
You heard right. Japan's economic woes are running deeper than just the trade war. Experts say the economy remains without a driving force and flagging domestic and foreign demand. And that's reflected in the first quarter GDP print. Japan's economy suffered its first contraction in a year in the March quarter, even before the bulk of US President Donald Trump's tariff measures took force. GDP for the first quarter shrank at an annualized pace of 0.7%, slightly worse than the 0.3% contraction economists had forecasted. That's also a reversal from the revised 2.4% gain in the fourth quarter. Stagnant private consumption and falling exports caused the decline. Exports fell 0.6%, while imports increased by nearly 3% as compared to the previous quarter. Private consumption, which is the biggest contributor to GDP, was flat for the period. The data highlights the challenges policymakers face as steep U.S. tariffs cloud the outlook for the export-reliant economy, particularly for the automobiles segment. It also raises the chances of a technical recession as Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba heads into an election. The contraction is likely to fuel ongoing political debate over the need for tax cuts or cash handouts. Observers say the figure could also mean that the Bank of Japan will have to wait a little longer before resuming its monetary tightening program. It recently signaled a one-year delay in reaching its inflation target. The calls for a pause in rate hikes gathering pace as well. One of the most dovish board members of the Bank of Japan says that the central bank must hold off raising interest rates for the time being, warning of growing downward pressure on the economy from higher U.S. tariffs. Japanese shares recouped earlier losses to end the day, choosing to focus on stronger than expected corporate earnings, overlooking a firmer yen and a weak GDP print. The Nikkei 225 ending flat after falling as much as 0.7% earlier in the session. The broader topics also reversed course, inching up 0.05%. And meantime, the yen is also gaining against the greenback by 0.1%, 145.50 to the dollar. The Nikkei had reclaimed that psychologically important level of 38,000 earlier this week. That's on hopes that a Japan trade deal could be on the cards after a tariff truce between US and China. But since then, the market has drifted lower as a lack of clarity on trade negotiations crimped the gains. Mid-sized brokerages in Japan have been hit by fraudulent trading, with third-party gaining access to client accounts and conducting illicit trades in Japanese equities. This comes after the country's biggest securities firms added new safeguards to protect client accounts. Japan's Financial Services Agency reported that fraudulent trades stemming from account takeovers surged more than tenfold from $179 million in March to around $2 billion in April, racking up losses for the account holders. There were more than 4,800 cases of unauthorized account access in April as compared to 1,420 a month before, underscoring the growing scale of the threat. In total, 9 brokerages were affected in April, and that's up from 5 in March. At least 10 brokerages have pledged to compensate clients for their losses. Meanwhile, the financial sector is tightening its defenses, with firms adopting multi-factor authentication to safeguard against hacking. South Korea's finance ministry says the economy is facing increasing downward pressure, with a slowdown in exports amid trade uncertainties weighing heavily on growth. Now, this is the first time that the government has pointed to strong exports in its monthly economic report, reflecting concerns over U.S. tariff policies. It adds that the country faces sluggish domestic consumption, while the jobs market difficulties persist. The ministry had forecast 1.8% growth for the economy in 2025. The finance ministry says the government will implement the $10 billion extra budget to support export firms and to boost their competitiveness while revitalizing the domestic economy. Despite the tepid outlook, South Korean shares rose, logging in a fifth week of gains. The benchmark Kospi closed up 0.21%. For the week, the index is also up about 2%. Meantime, the Korean won has strengthened against the dollar. Chinese and Hong Kong stocks extended their losses. Market sentiment came under pressure from renewed US-China tech tensions and a disappointing earnings report card from Alibaba. Alibaba closed down 4.27% after the e-commerce giant posted quarterly revenues below analyst expectations yesterday. NVIDIA is planning to build a research and development center in Shanghai. Now, it's a bid by the chip-making giant to remain competitive in the world's second-largest economy amid falling sales brought on by U.S. export controls. Sources familiar with the matter says that NVIDIA chief Jensen Huang had discussed plans with Shanghai Mayor Gongcheng last month. The chipmaker employs some 2,000 in the city, mostly in sales and support functions. But it is looking to expand by hiring engineers and researchers to work on global R&D projects with a focus on autonomous driving, among others. It says that the design and production of chips will remain outside China to comply with U.S. export controls. The tougher U.S. controls in recent years have prevented the California-based firm from selling certain AI chips to China. As a result, it now faces tougher competition from local players in crucial markets, including Huawei. Chinese clients, however, remain cautious if the chip maker can offer a chip that satisfies both their needs and Washington's demands. NVIDIA's announcement comes also as the Trump administration takes a tougher stance on Huawei. It issued a warning this week to companies around the world that the use of AI chips manufactured by Huawei could trigger criminal penalties for violating U.S. export controls. Taiwan chip materials maker Global Wafers will be more than doubling its investment in the U.S. It is planning to spend an additional $4 billion, bringing its total expenditure in America to $7.5 billion. Global Wafers said that the additional spending will be used to meet U.S. clients' growing demands for locally made supplies to reduce potential tariff uncertainties. The firm made the announcement at the opening of its new facility in Texas. It also revealed its intention to expand the plant to boost its production capabilities. The factory manufactures Global Wafers' most advanced integrated silicon wafer and is the only such site in the U.S. currently. The Taiwanese company plans to boost its presence in America. It's part of a larger trend of similar firms moving there. TSMC, one of Global Wafers' clients, also among those shifting production. The Taiwanese firms have been migrating to America in recent years due to U.S. sanctions on China, but the shift has since been accelerated after President Trump's threats of tariff and trade barriers. Taiwan Premier Zhuo Rongtai has said that trade talks between the U.S. is one of the highlights of his cabinet's performance in the past year. That's as the cabinet prepares to mark the first anniversary of being in office last week. A trade and response to U.S. tariff policies are expected to be at the front and center of William Lai's government's first annual report card. Premier Zhuo says that the first round of trade talks with the U.S. concluded amicably in end of April, and Taiwan is working closely with the U.S. to bring down tariffs that have been hit by some of the island's key export sectors. Mr. Zhuo didn't go into specifics, but stressed that Taiwan's negotiating team is walking a fine line. Now, it's actively pushing for lower duties while making sure that the island's industries don't lose their competitive edge.
我们谈判的最终目的是维持国家的最大利益，也维持产业的国际竞争力。对于国内的各项产业，尤其是国人的健康以及消费市场的习惯，我们会坚持必要该坚持的原则。
And I'll be back a little later on. Otelli.
All right, looking forward to that. Thanks so much in the meantime, Roland. All right, time now for another break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight. APEC members warn Asia is facing stalled trade and an economic slowdown, even as they call for greater cooperation in a joint statement. We'll get more insight when we speak next with Eduardo Pedrosa, Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. You're watching East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we've been following. South Korea's presidential campaign enters day 5. Latest poll from Gallup Korea showing Democratic Party candidate Lee Jae-myung maintaining a solid lead against his rivals. Now, Japan's economy shrank for the first time in a year and at a faster pace than expected, underscoring the fragile nature of its recovery and threats from looming U.S. tariffs. And APEC trade ministers wrap up 2 days of talks in South Korea, saying they are concerned about fundamental challenges to global trade. But officials stress they remain committed to overcoming those difficulties and call for greater cooperation. And for more, let's bring in Eduardo Pedrosa, Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Pedrosa, for joining us this evening. Firstly, I want to talk about that last-minute agreement that was reached, that you got a joint statement out of that. I'm curious to know, what are some of the key compromises that had to be made in order to get everybody on the same page? And do you foresee, these compromises also holding up in the future?
Hi, good evening, Telly. I'm here in Jeju. It took a lot of work to get the joint statement out. There are lots of different concerns about the trade system at the moment, but there are also a lot of shared interests in making progress on these issues. So it does take some time. We have a different and divergent set of economies that are members of APEC, but there is a strong will to succeed and use the trade system and use trade as a driver of growth.
Right, and I certainly hear optimism there when you talked about shared interest and you're trying to reach that common goal. But unfortunately, there wasn't a discussion in terms of agreeing to a joint response that's specific to U.S. Tariffs, though. I guess each country has been mentioned facing significantly different circumstances. But do you think those differing positions could cause problems for APEC's unity, maybe not now, but down the road?
Well, I think what we saw today was a really useful exchange of views, and it really plants the seeds for further discussions in the lead up to the APEC Leaders Week coming up at the end of October. I mean, this is the first meeting to take place after the Switzerland talks, so we're very happy with the amount of space that was created then, and it really created a platform for not just China and the US to speak again, but for other economies in the region to engage in those discussions and how the current trading environment affects them.
And I guess part of that, with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, also there, I guess, a lot of countries were trying to meet him, and we've talked about he had recent meetings with China's Vice Commerce Minister and also other APEC trade ministers. I know that, you're not supposed to divulge a lot of these bilateral discussions, but can we just get a hint, some sort of an outcome or commitment we can expect from these talks, particularly regarding that 90-day tariff reduction agreement with China?
Yeah, well, I can't speak directly to the bilateral talks, but I think all of the trade ministers that were there tried to have discussions with Ambassador Greer, and I understand that there is success in that. So we are very hopeful on what will come out of that. On the 90-day reprieve, there's still time for all of the region's economies to make progress on these issues. And of course, the APEC meetings did provide that platform for the bilateral discussions and finding mutual landing zones on what are the US concerns, what are each other's concerns. So I keep a very positive outlook on this. I mean, if we think about where we were at the beginning of April and where we are now, that's an enormous change in outlook that we see. And APEC's value was really demonstrated here in providing a way forward and a way to engage each other on these issues.
And what is the kind of best case scenario outcome you think will happen after the 90 days?
Well, it's going to take time to reach agreements, but as we have been seeing, some of these agreements have been much faster than expected. So what we will see over the coming months, we're not quite sure. But again, I'm optimistic, and we have to understand what the US interests are, what our own respective interests are, the impact they have on our economic growth, and the willingness that we have to move forward.
So now, Mr. Greer, aside from representatives from China, he's also met up with South Korea and Malaysia during the APEC conference. These sort of bilateral talks, how do you see it influencing perhaps broader APEC negotiations? Because there is going to be another leaders summit sometime later this year. Am I right?
That's right. The bilateral discussions really do help to build mutual understanding and find ways that the whole APEC system can come to agreement when it comes to actually drafting a statement. It's hard to know what exactly each other want if you don't talk to each other on a bilateral basis.
And actually, when we were speaking to our Korean correspondent earlier, she said there was actually really good atmosphere when she was talking among the delegates that, they were happy with all these multilateral trade meetings. There's so much focus now, right, on all the tariffs from the U.S. How important do you think it is right now for APEC to back up the World Trade Organization and ensure that it remains a solid framework for global trade?
There was a lot of discussion during our meetings about backing up the World Trade Organization. And they were very frank about these issues and finding issues where we could come to agreement. It was very clear, for example, that the trade rules are somewhat behind the curve, and we don't have something that really covers e-commerce. There are other issues that are on the table, which we call the joint statement initiatives. We're looking at subsidies for fish, and these were all issues that were well addressed. So yes, the atmospheres at Jeju were extremely positive, and people really did see common ground on how to address this with a specific focus on what can we do to improve the WTO, including its rulemaking and dispute settlement mechanism.
So, Mr. Pedrosa, were there any new strategic partnerships or alliances being explored to protect some of the key industries from, like, whether it's shipbuilding or automotive exports from this fallout surrounding the U.S. tariffs?
We didn't come to any specific issues for specific sectors, but for sure there were issues on the sidelines where our member economies could discuss these kind of more sort of sector-specific issues. I mean, there was discussions, for example, about the next round for addressing fisheries subsidies. So again, there's so many issues that are on the table, and finding ways amongst 21 regional economies is going to be difficult, but it's also extremely important for the global economy.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to chat with us. Eduardo Pedrosa, Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. Now, the latest opinion poll for South Korea's presidential race shows Democratic Party candidate Lee Jae-myung maintaining a solid lead against his People Power Party rival Kim Moon-soo. Well, a Gallup Korea survey shows opposition leader Lee has 51% support among the 1,000 South Koreans polled this week. Now, that's head and shoulders above the ruling PPP candidate, who earned the nod from just 29% of those surveyed. Lee Jun-suk of the New Reform Party has 8% support in the three-way race for the top job, while 12% said they were simply undecided. Campaigning is in its fifth day, and the candidates will be holding their first televised debate this Sunday. The vote early next month will pick a successor to former President Yoon Suk-yeol, who was ousted over his failed martial law bid that threw the country into political turmoil. Taiwan is set to turn off its last nuclear reactor on Saturday, in line with the island's so-called nuclear-free homeland goal to phase out all atomic energy this year. The power plant in question is the 40-year-old Ma-anshan reactor in southern Pingtung County. Well, it's only supplying some 4% of Taiwan's energy needs, but the timing raises the risk of an energy crunch amid heightened energy needs from its chip manufacturing sector. The move will increase Taiwan's reliance on fuel from abroad and also will make the island more vulnerable to a Chinese blockade, which could cut off critical imports. Renewable energy has been built around the site, and more is planned on the facility grounds. Nuclear plants used to supply more than 50% of Taiwan's energy needs. But anti-nuclear sentiment grew after the 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan. Taiwan President William Lai has insisted that the island's energy supply will remain stable. But he also said that a return to nuclear energy one day is not entirely off the cards. On Wednesday, lawmakers revised legislation that allows a restart of the island's atomic plants, suggesting a policy shift is in motion. Thai authorities have arrested 17 people in connection with the collapse of a high-risk building in Bangkok that was triggered by an earthquake late March. One of them is Thai construction tycoon Premchai Kanasut, who heads Italian Thai Development, or ITD. His company was in a joint venture with China Railway No. 10, the Thai office of the state-owned Chinese infrastructure giant, to build a new state audit office, which collapsed while under construction. Engineers, architects and executives working for the project's contractors have also been arrested. The 17 are being charged with building code violations and professional negligence leading to death, offences that carry a penalty of up to 20 years imprisonment. Police say their investigation uncovered discrepancies in the design and the actual building, as well as subpar material being used. 92 people were killed in the collapse, all of them workers involved in the construction. Coming up on East Asia tonight, a roundup of the first quarterly performance of China's tech giants and an assessment of the country's tech sector with Roland Lim. Singapore is seeking preferential tariffs as low as 0% on pharmaceuticals with the U.S. Deputy Prime Minister Gan Kim-yong says that talks with the U.S. Secretary of Commerce are underway, but it may take a long engagement before any details are known. The U.S. previously announced it might introduce tariffs for this sector. Well, Mr. Gan spoke on the issue when he was updating the progress of the Singapore Economic Resilience Task Force.
Both Singapore and US can sit down and discuss some form of a concession for Singapore to have a beneficial or preferential tariff, even to the extent of a zero tariff for pharmaceutical exports to the US. That you will require some efforts on the Singapore side to ensure that the supply chain for this pharmaceutical is secured. And these are the details that we are discussing. And this is a significant opportunity and a significant agreement, because although it's not the baseline 10%, but it's a very specific sectoral tariff. And pharmaceutical export is an important part of Singapore's exports to the US.
Mr. Gan also added that the US-China agreement on lower tariffs is a good sign, but uncertainty remains.
So these are encouraging developments, but I should sound a word of caution because the outlook remains very uncertain. What will happen at the end of 90 days is still a big question mark. It's yet to be known, and whether the negotiation with the other countries will progress smoothly, whether they will eventually settle at a level that are mutually agreeable and workable is something that is still yet to be seen. The discussion between China and US, of course, is right at the beginning, is a starting point. I think the journey will be quite long.
Roland is here once again to update us with the latest from the business world. And Roland, investors betting big on AI for the revival of China's tech sector, they have got some kind of a wake-up call.
That's right, Oteli. Now, after Alibaba's less than impressive performance, experts say that market expectations had perhaps run ahead of the realities on the ground, both in terms of China's consumption recovery and the pace of AI monetization. I'll delve into that in a bit, but first, Singapore Airlines says there has been a surge in passenger traffic into China in recent months, but outbound travel has still not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. That's as the world's second largest economy was slower than the rest of the world to return to international flying. Its chief commercial officer says capacity into China for the carrier's full-service airline was largely recovered to pre-pandemic levels, but low-cost subsidiary Scoot is flying about 80% of its pre-COVID capacity into China. Singapore Airlines reported a record annual net profit boosted by one-off gains from a merger of its 49% Indian carrier Vistara as well as Air India. But lower airfares in response to increased competition weighed on operating profit. Singapore Airlines at the same time says it has 10 billion Singapore dollars in fixed deposits and another 3.3 billion Sing in undrawn credit lines to withstand any slowdown in business. Now, these include the potential impact of shifting tariff policies and geopolitical uncertainties. Still, CEO Goh Chun Fong says that challenges ahead are unlikely to match the scale of disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic. The airline posted a record annual profit of $2.8 billion for its latest financial year. Beyond its financial strength, the airline highlights two pillars of strength: a resilient workforce and its digital transformation efforts. Now, it adds that its diversified global passenger flight and cargo networks continue to give it a competitive edge.
Wherever the cargo flows go, we have the network to be able to manage that. So for example, in the days when immediately after the implementation of the US tariff on China, we were able to fill our Singapore-USA flights with cargoes from Southeast Asia rather than from China, where it was more greatly impacted.
Now, with China's tech giants reporting mixed earnings and the country's AI race heating up, the question on everybody's mind is, has the AI frenzy, is it fading? And did the market get ahead of itself when it came to expectations for Alibaba, Tencent and JD.com? Well, Roland Liv is back with us again. And let's just get straight to it, Roland, and talk about Alibaba's revenue. Apparently, it missed estimates despite strong growth in cloud and AI. Is this then a sign that the AI buzz is really starting to fizzle?
Well, not quite. I'd say that the AI narrative is still alive and kicking. But investors are starting to differentiate between storytelling and actual revenue earnings power for these AI companies. So for Alibaba, it's got an all-in-one AI strategy. It's invested heavily, $50 billion into AI infrastructure, as well as its model like its Q13 that is developing very quickly. So the payoff for Alibaba is very much at an early stage. So the frenzy isn't about fading, but it's also about the fact that the market's a little bit more sober about where execution actually matters. Why did Alibaba shares go down when its AI revenues actually, as you said, logged in triple-digit growths? Well, the fact is it came down to expectations. I mean, Alibaba's analysts were expecting the kind of liftoff that they got from AI stocks in the US, like Microsoft and NVIDIA. That didn't happen. Why? Because, well, there is weakness of consumption in China. And on top of that, there is also intense competition from the likes of JD.com, Pinduoduo. So that's also eroding into Alibaba's profits.
I want to talk about Tencent. The quarter was pretty strong, 13% revenue growth, 14% profit. Would you say that they are considered the new AI darling?
Well, Tencent has been a lot more tactical. What I mean by that is that they actually quietly integrated their AI into their platforms like WeChat, into advertising, as well as into gaming. So they have a chatbot called Yuanbao, and tools like AI advert generating apps, as well as non-player characters in gaming. That's all actually starting to create new monetization streams. So they've been very clever at doing that. So they're not only just investing in AI strategies and models like Alibaba, but they're also putting it into products that people are using today. And so that's actually boosted their bottom line.
So then is it fair to make that comparison that the market overestimated Alibaba and underestimated Tencent? Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, you probably hit that on the nail. I mean, Alibaba's earnings came into the reporting season with high expectations because of the buzz around things like DeepSeek as well as Q1. Tencent exceeded expectations because they had been practical about the AI side of things. But let's not also forget JD.com, who also exceeded expectations with their earnings simply because they outperformed on the fundamentals. They actually had strength in their logistics side of things, and also the fact that their operating margins improved. So it's not all just about AI for these tech companies.
So all in, would you say that analysts basically jumped the gun on this idea of a tech revival specific to China?
I think to some extent, yes. I think there are hopes that the AI boom would actually lift all boats, and that was a bit premature. I think that we are seeing selective recovery in the AI sector. As I mentioned earlier, it's all about execution. Tencent is benefiting from a very deep ecosystem, practical use of AI. Alibaba still struggling with restructuring its business, investing heavily into AI, so it's not a proven revenue stream yet. And JD.com, of course, is also fighting heavily in fierce competition with the rest.
All right, it's always good talking to you, Roland, but I'm going to leave you now to let you enjoy the rest of your Friday evening. Thank you so much for that, Roland. Now, Seoul says that the number of North Koreans employed in South Korea's public sector has reached an all-time high. There were 211 North Korean defectors working in government and administrative roles last year. That's 17 more than in 2023. Well, this increase comes as Seoul expands support for the escapees as they adjust to their new lives in the South. The South Korea's Ministry of Unification, meantime, says that there is a growing need to boost opportunities for North Korean defectors, and this will allow them to participate in and contribute to the government's reunification efforts. Some 30,000 defectors currently live in the South. Before 2020, more than 1,000 North Koreans fled to the South every year, but numbers have dropped since the pandemic, which saw border closures. Well, the work of calligraphy by a South Korean independence hero is breaking new auction records in Seoul. It's part of a wave of historic artwork being brought home by the country's ultra-rich. The calligraphy Green Bamboo fetched more than $650,000 in an auction last month. That's more than 3 times its opening bid. It's the work of Jung-geun, who assassinated Japan's first prime minister, Ito Hirobumi, in 1909. He was hanged for the killing by Japanese authorities, who see him as a terrorist. Wrote an autobiography and made hundreds of calligraphy pieces while waiting for his execution. Months after his death, Tokyo occupied the Korean peninsula until the end of World War II. He remains controversial till today. A move to honor him in 2013 by Seoul and Beijing sparked a diplomatic row with Tokyo. Now, the piece was sold to the family of South Korean energy conglomerate LS Group, who said they wish to share it with the public and may donate it to a national institution. And that's East Asia tonight, this Friday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And you can also find us on Facebook and YouTube. Have a great Friday and a great weekend. Thanks for watching.